April of the year 1942. The mountains of northern Persia rose against a sky so clear it seemed unreal, untouched by the war that raged across Europe and North Africa. The Polish soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company moved through the rough terrain, part of General Anders' army, forming in exile after their release from Soviet labor camps. They were men who had survived imprisonment and starvation, who had watched comrades die in the frozen wastes of Kazakhstan and Siberia, who carried the weight of a homeland occupied and divided between two enemies. They moved south through Persia toward Palestine, toward training and eventual deployment, toward a war they would fight not for glory, but for the slim hope of someday returning to a free Poland. It was near the town of Hamadan that they encountered the boy. He was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, thin and ragged, leading a donkey along the mountain path. In a cloth sack tied to the animal's side, something moved and whimpered. The soldiers stopped, more from curiosity than concern, and the boy approached them with the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to negotiating with strangers. Private Henryk Zakharevich, a farm boy from eastern Poland who spoke a few words of Farsi learned during their journey, asked what the boy carried. The child opened the sack to reveal a Syrian brown bear cub, perhaps 2 or 3 months old, its eyes barely open, its fur still downy and soft. The mother had been shot by hunters, the boy explained through gestures and broken phrases. He was trying to sell the orphan for whatever he could get: food, cigarettes, coin. The soldiers gathered around, these hard men who had survived horrors that should have stripped away all its softness, and they looked at the small creature with something like wonder. Lieutenant Anatol Tarnoyeki, the company's commanding officer, pulled on a tin of condensed milk from his rations and a few Persian coins from his pocket. The exchange was made without ceremony. The boy took his payment and disappeared down the mountain path. The soldiers stood holding a bear cub that weighed perhaps 15 pounds, looking at each other with the half-embarrassed realization that they had just adopted an animal they had no means to care for in the middle of a war. They named him Wojtek, a diminutive of Wojciech, a common Polish name that meant he who enjoys war or smiling warrior. The irony was not lost on them. They fed him condensed milk from a vodka bottle with a makeshift nipple fashioned from cloth, taking turns holding him through the night when he cried, warming him against the cold desert darkness that followed the scorching days. For men who had lost everything, homes and families, freedom and country, the act of caring for something small and helpless restored a humanity they had feared was gone forever. May 1942. We have adopted a bear. This sounds mad when written down, but in this strange exile, separated from Poland by thousands of miles and 2 occupying armies, the bear makes more sense than almost anything else. His name is Wojtek. He drinks milk from a bottle and sleeps between us for warmth. The men who, a month ago, could barely smile, now laugh at his clumsy attempts to walk. Perhaps this is what we needed, something innocent to protect, something that depends on us not for war, but for simple care. The cub grew quickly on a diet of milk and fruit, and whatever scraps the soldiers could spare from their own rations. By the time the company reached Palestine in summer of 1942, Wojtek had tripled in size and developed a personality that was equal parts mischievous and affectionate. He followed the soldiers like a dog, wrestling with them in mock combat that became less mock as he grew stronger, learning to recognize individual men by scent and voice. He slept in their tents, ate at their mess, and attended their formations with the casual authority of someone who belonged. The British officers overseeing the Polish forces in Palestine regarded Wojtek with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. A bear was not standard military equipment, and regulations said nothing about feeding and housing exotic animals. But the Polish soldiers were adamant. Wojtek was part of their company, a brother in arms regardless of species, and where they went, he went. The British, recognizing that morale among the Polish exiles was fragile, and that interfering with the bear might cause more problems than it solved, allowed the situation to continue with the stipulation that the Poles were responsible for any damage or incidents the animal caused. By 1943, Wojtek stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed over 400 pounds. He had developed habits that would have seemed absurd if they weren't documented by dozens of witnesses and photographs. He drank beer, which the soldiers gave him in small amounts as a treat, holding the bottle in his paws and tilting it back like a man. He smoked cigarettes, or rather, ate them, having learned that approaching soldiers with his mouth open usually resulted in someone giving him a lit cigarette that he would chew contentedly. He loved fruit, particularly oranges and marmalade, which he would steal from the mess tent if given the opportunity. He wrestled with soldiers, engaging in bouts that required multiple men to handle him as his strength became genuinely formidable. He had learned to salute, raising his paw to his head in a gesture that might have been trained or might have been coincidence, but that never failed to produce laughter. But Wojtek was more than entertainment. He had become a symbol of something the soldiers struggled to articulate, a connection to normal life, to the simple pleasure of caring for another creature, to the humanity that military service and occupation had tried to strip away. When they groomed his fur, or brought him fruit, or wrestled with him in the evening, they were briefly not soldiers in exile, but simply men showing affection to an animal they loved. In a world defined by violence and loss, Wojtek represented innocence preserved, joy that persisted despite everything. The British commanders preparing to deploy Polish forces to the Italian campaign in 1943 faced a logistical problem. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was slated to move to Italy as part of the Polish Second Corps, but military transport regulations were explicit. Only authorized personnel could board military vessels. A bear, however beloved, was not authorized personnel. The solution was characteristically Polish, in its mixture of bureaucratic compliance and creative subversion. In August 1943, Wojtek was officially enlisted in the Polish army. He received a paybook, a serial number, and the rank of private. His rations were authorized and documented. He was listed on the company roster as a soldier of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, entitled to all the rights and privileges thereof, including transportation to the combat zone. The British transport officers examined the paperwork, noted that it was technically correct, if entirely unprecedented, and allowed the bear to board with his unit. The voyage to Italy took them through the Suez Canal and across the Mediterranean. Wojtek traveled in the hold with the other soldiers, sleeping on the floor, eating his authorized rations, apparently unbothered by the motion of the sea. The men played cards and told stories and shared their food with him. And for a few days, the war seemed distant, despite the fact that they were sailing directly toward it. They arrived in Italy in December 1943, disembarking at Taranto and moving north toward the positions where the Polish Second Corps would take up its place in the Allied line. The Italian winter was cold and wet, the mountains treacherous, the German defenses formidable. The Allies were stalled before Monte Cassino, an ancient monastery, perched atop a mountain that dominated the roads to Rome, converted by the Germans into a fortress that had already repulsed multiple assaults with devastating casualties. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company established itself behind the front lines, responsible for transporting ammunition and supplies to the artillery batteries that would support the infantry assault. The work was dangerous. German artillery and aircraft targeted supply envoys regularly, and the mountain roads were exposed to observation and fire. The soldiers worked through the winter and into the spring of 1944, moving shells and explosives under conditions that tested endurance and courage without the recognition that frontline combat received. Wojtek adapted to the war zone with remarkable calm. He seemed unbothered by the sound of artillery, by the distant crump of explosions, by the aircraft that occasionally strafed the roads. He watched the soldiers work with apparent interest, sometimes following them on supply runs, more often waiting at the camp for their return. He had grown to his full size now, over 500 pounds, powerful enough to be dangerous if he chose, but gentle with the men who had raised him. He recognized them individually, greeting each returning soldier with evident pleasure, wrestling or simply sitting beside them with the comfortable companionship of shared experience. It was during the preparation for the fourth and final assault on Monte Cassino that Wojtek became more than mascot or symbol. The battle was scheduled to begin on May 11th, 1944, and in the days before, the artillery batteries were positioned and supplied with mountains of ammunition. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company worked around the clock, transporting 25-pound shells from the depots to the gun positions. Brutal labor made more difficult by the terrain and the constant threat of German counter-battery fire. The soldiers worked in teams, loading crates of shells onto trucks, unloading them at the gun positions, returning for more in an endless cycle. The crates weighed nearly 50 pounds each, awkward and heavy, requiring 2 men to carry safely. The work was exhausting. The May heat, already building even in the mountains, dust and sweat, and the constant tension of working in a combat zone. Wojtek watched for a while, then approached one of the working parties. He had seen the soldiers lifting and carrying the crates hundreds of times. Now, with the deliberate curiosity that characterized his interactions with human activity, he reached for a crate. The soldiers watched in astonishment as he picked it up, cradling the wooden box in his arms, and looked at them expectantly. Private Dmitry Savlugo, understanding what Wojtek intended, pointed toward the truck. The bear walked to it and placed the crate in the bed with surprising care, then returned for another. Within minutes, a system had developed. Soldiers loaded crates. Wojtek carried them to the truck, moving with steady patience that matched the rhythm of the work. He carried ammunition for hours that day, never tiring, never dropping a crate, working alongside the men with a focus that suggested he understood the importance of what they were doing. May 10th, 1944. Tomorrow, the assault begins. We have spent the day moving ammunition to the guns, and Wojtek worked beside us. He carried crates of shells, as if he understood that these were the tools with which we would try to break the German line. The men are exhausted, but seeing the bear work gives them something, not courage exactly, but a reminder that we are not alone, that even in this place of death, there is companionship and shared purpose. If a bear can face the guns without fear, perhaps so can we. The Battle of Monte Cassino began at 11 p.m. on May 11th, 1944, with a massive artillery barrage that lit the night sky and shook the ground for miles. Over 1,600 guns fired simultaneously, thousands of shells screaming toward the German positions in a bombardment that dwarfed anything yet seen in the Italian campaign. The Polish Second Corps, assigned to attack the monastery itself, would face the most difficult objective, assaulting up steep slopes against prepared defenses, fighting their way through minefields and wire and concrete bunkers. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company worked through the barrage, bringing forward more ammunition as the guns consumed shells at a rate that seemed impossible to sustain. Wojtek worked with them, carrying crates through the darkness, apparently unbothered by the noise that left men half-deaf and disoriented. He moved with the same steady patience he had shown in training, placing crates carefully, returning for more, working hour after hour as the battle raged on the mountain above them. The assault continued for days. The Polish infantry attacked again and again, taking terrible casualties, but pushing forward with determination, born of years of exile and occupation. They were fighting not just for tactical objectives, but for Polish honor, for the right to return home with heads high, for the chance to prove that Poland still existed, even if its territory was occupied. The monastery, that ancient symbol of faith and learning, had become a symbol of something else. The test of Polish courage and the price of Polish freedom. On May 18, 1944, Polish soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of Monte Cassino. The Germans had withdrawn during the night, unable to hold against the relentless Polish assault. The cost had been terrible, over 4,000 Polish casualties in a week of fighting. But the objective was taken. The road to Rome was open, and the Polish Second Corps had written its name in the history of the war with blood and courage. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company celebrated quietly, too exhausted for jubilation, aware that their war was not finished. They gathered around Wojtek, who sat among them accepting fruit and cigarettes and affection. And they told each other that the bear had brought them luck, that his calm under fire had steadied their nerves, that carrying ammunition alongside a bear had made them feel that anything was possible. The commander of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, recognizing Wojtek's contribution, authorized a change to the unit's insignia. The company badge would now feature a bear carrying an artillery shell, a permanent commemoration of Wojtek's service at Monte Cassino. The image spread throughout the Polish forces and beyond, becoming a symbol of the Polish contribution to the Italian campaign and the spirit that had carried them through years of exile and struggle. The war continued. The Polish Second Corps fought its way up the Italian peninsula, through the Gothic line, and into northern Italy, always moving forward, always paying the price in casualties and exhaustion. Wojtek accompanied them, still carrying supplies, still wrestling with soldiers in the evening, still providing the companionship and morale that made the war bearable. He had become famous beyond the Polish forces. British and American soldiers knew of him. Italian civilians brought him fruit and bread. Correspondents wrote stories about the soldier bear who fought at Monte Cassino. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The Polish Second Corps found itself in Italy, victorious but homeless, unable to return to a Poland now firmly under Soviet control. The soldiers who had fought their way from Siberia to Italy, who had liberated Monte Cassino and crossed the Gothic line, were now stateless refugees, waiting to see what the front-war world would offer them. Many of the Polish forces were eventually relocated to Scotland, where the British government offered them settlement rather than repatriation to Soviet-controlled Poland. The 22nd Artillery Supply Company was among those who chose Scotland over returning to a homeland that no longer welcomed those who had fought in the West. In November 1945, they arrived in Scotland with their equipment, their records, and their bear. Wojtek adapted to Scotland with the same calm he had shown adapting to everything else. The Scottish weather suited him better than the Mediterranean heat, and he seemed content in the cold and rain. But the peacetime military had no place for a bear on active duty, even one with a service record and campaign medals. The decision was made, reluctantly but inevitably, that Wojtek would be transferred to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he could be cared for properly, and where his former comrades could visit him. The transfer took place in 1947, after the company had been formally disbanded, and the soldiers had begun transitioning to civilian life. They brought Wojtek to the zoo in a truck, the same type of vehicle he had helped load during the war, and they walked him to his new enclosure with the ceremony due a soldier leaving active service. Some of the men wept. Others stood silent, unable to articulate what the bear had meant to them, what he represented of their years in exile and war. They gave him fruit, and cigarettes one last time, wrestled with him gently, and left him in the care of zookeepers who would never fully understand what this particular bear had experienced. But they visited. Throughout the years that Wojtek lived at the Edinburgh Zoo, his old comrades came to see him. They spoke to him in Polish, brought him his favorite foods, told him stories of the old days, as if he could understand. And perhaps he could, because witnesses reported that Wojtek responded to Polish speech with more animation than to English, that he recognized his former comrades even years after separation, that he seemed happiest when surrounded by the men who had raised him from a cub in the Persian mountains. August 1953. I visited Wojtek today at the zoo. He is old now, moving more slowly, his fur graying, but he recognized me. He pressed against the bars, and I reached through to scratch behind his ears the way he always liked. We have both grown old far from Poland. Both ended our service in a foreign land, both carrying memories of a war that seems increasingly distant. I told him about the boys, my sons, who never knew the war, who think of me as simply their father rather than a soldier. I told him we won, but lost, that Poland is free of the Nazis, but not free, that we cannot go home. He listened, or seemed to, and I felt that he understood as much as anyone could. We shared something during the war, not just companionship, but a kind of brotherhood that transcended species. We endured together, and that bond survives even here, even now, even in this strange peace that is not quite what we fought for. Wojtek died on December 2nd, 1963, at the age of 21. His death was noted in newspapers across Britain and Poland, and his obituary read like a soldier's. Born in Persia, enlisted in the Polish army, served at Monte Cassino, retired to Edinburgh. His former comrades gathered to remember him, telling stories of the bear who drank beer and smoked cigarettes, who carried ammunition under fire and wrestled in the evening, who had represented something essential about humanity persisting through inhumanity. In the years since, Wojtek has become something more than a curious footnote to the war. Statues have been erected in his honor, in Edinburgh and in Krakow, in London, and in Ottawa. Bronze bears carrying artillery shells, permanent commemorations of a story that seems too strange to be true, but is verified by photographs and records, and the testimony of hundreds of men who served alongside him. The image of the bear has become the emblem of the Polish Second Corps, appearing on memorials and monuments, representing the courage and sacrifice of men who fought far from home for a country they could not return to. The story of Wojtek resonates because it captures something essential about war that official histories often miss. War is not just battles and strategy, casualties and victories. It is also the small moments of humanity that survive despite everything. The decision to save an orphaned bear cub, the patience to raise him on condensed milk, the instinct to bring him along rather than abandon him, the joy of watching him work beside soldiers who had lost everything else. These moments do not change the outcome of battles or alter the course of history, but they change the men who experience them, reminding them what they are fighting to protect. Wojtek was not a warrior in any real sense. He did not fire weapons or charge positions or display tactical brilliance. What he did was simpler and perhaps more important. He reminded men at war that they were still human, still capable of affection and humor and care for something beyond themselves. He carried ammunition not because he understood the cause, but because the men he loved asked him to. And that simple act of companionship under fire meant more to those men than any speech or medal could convey. The soldiers of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company fought through some of the war's most difficult campaigns. They endured exile and imprisonment, starvation and forced labor, years of combat in the worst conditions. They won their battles but lost their homeland, achieving victory but not the peace they had hoped for. Many never returned to Poland, spending their lives in Britain or America or Canada, carrying memories of a country that existed only in the past and in their hearts. But they also carried memories of a who had shared their journey, who had made them laugh when laughter seemed impossible, who had worked beside them when the work seemed unbearable, who had reminded them daily that goodness and innocence could survive even in the darkest times. Those memories sustained them through the long years of exile, providing evidence that their humanity had not been destroyed by what they had endured and done. Wojtek's story has been told and retold in books and documentaries, in articles and monuments, each telling trying to capture what made a bear's service in World War II significant beyond its obvious novelty. The answer lies not in what Wojtek did, though what he did was remarkable, but in what he represented: the persistence of decency in indecent times, the survival of affection in a world of hatred, the ability of men to care for something even when they themselves had been abandoned and dispossessed. The Polish soldiers who found a bear cub in Persia in 1942 could have left him to die. They were refugees themselves, barely surviving, with no resources to spare for an animal who would require constant care. But they chose to save him, to raise him, to make him part of their family, even as they marched toward war. That choice defined them as much as any battle they fought. It proved that they retained the capacity for mercy and love despite everything that had been done to them. And Wojtek repaid that mercy in ways both practical and profound. He carried ammunition when the men were exhausted. He lifted their spirits when morale flagged. He gave them something to protect and care for when everything else had been taken from them. He reminded them, simply by existing, that the world contained more than violence and loss, that joy and companionship could persist even in war, that they were fighting not just against enemies, but for the possibility of a world where such simple goodness could flourish. The war ended more than 70 years ago. The soldiers who served with Wojtek are nearly all gone now, their memories preserved in archives and oral histories. The bear himself is long dead, his remains lost to time. But the story persists, told and retold, because it speaks to something universal about the human experience of war. In the midst of history's greatest conflict, when millions died and entire nations were consumed by hatred, a group of Polish soldiers found an orphaned bear and chose to love him. That choice, and everything that followed from it, proved that humanity could survive anything if men chose to preserve it. Wojtek the soldier bear carried more than artillery shells at Monte Cassino. He carried hope. He carried proof that compassion persisted. He carried the evidence that men at war remained men, capable of tenderness alongside violence, of care alongside duty, of love alongside loss. And in carrying those things, he served as truly as any soldier, fighting not with weapons, but with his simple presence, his steady companionship, his reminder that the world contained more than war. The monuments to Wojtek stand in cities across the world, bronze bears frozen in the act of carrying shells, permanent testaments to a story that seems impossible but happened. They commemorate not just a bear, but what that bear represented: the humanity that survived the inhumanity, the decency that persisted through indecency, the love that endured despite every reason to abandon it. They stand as reminders that war, for all its horror and waste, cannot entirely destroy what makes us human if we choose to hold on to it. In the end, Wojtek's greatest victory was not at Monte Cassino, though he served there with honor. His greatest victory was simpler and more profound. He helped a group of exiled soldiers remember what they were fighting for. Not conquest or glory, not revenge or domination, but the chance to live in a world where a bear could be loved, where companionship mattered more than utility, where kindness had value even when everything else had been stripped away. That is the true story of Wojtek, the soldier bear, who fought the knot. Not a story of heroism in the conventional sense, but a story of humanity preserved against all odds. A story of men who chose mercy when they could have chosen cruelty, who chose care when they could have chosen indifference, who chose to bring a bear to war because that bear represented everything worth fighting for. And in that choice, they won a victory that mattered more than Monte Cassino, more than medals or commendations, more than any military objective. They proved that even in the darkest times, even in the midst of total war, the human capacity for love and compassion could not be destroyed. They proved it with every bottle of milk fed to a cub, every wrestling match, every crate of ammunition carried by a bear who worked beside them because he loved them and they loved him. That is what Wojtek means. That is why his story endures. Not because a bear in uniform is amusing, though it is, but because that bear proves something essential about who we are and who we can choose to be, even when the world burns around us. We can choose mercy. We can choose care. We can choose to save an orphaned bear cub in the mountains of Persia and bring him with us through years of war, not because it is practical or necessary, but because it is right and good and human. Wojtek the bear, private in the Polish army, veteran of Monte Cassino, retired to Edinburgh Zoo, died December 2nd, 1963. He was loved. He was remembered. He was, in his way, a soldier who served with honor. And his service reminds us still that sometimes, in the strangest forms and most unlikely places, humanity survives.